So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and talking a little bit about livestock integration in the cover crops. So Jen Elliot, she and her husband have a farm outside of Troy, Palouse Prairie Farms. They started their operation in 2006 and raised grass-fed and finished beef as well as heritage pork. She has a great interest in soil health, doing innovative techniques on their property, cover cropping, planned grazing, no-till farming, and high crop diversity. So with that, Jen, come on up.
Well, I just want to start by saying how good it makes me feel to see so many people, producers, gathered together, because I feel like, I don't know, it seems like this year in particular, this winter, there's been all sorts of presentations talking about soil health, all these different things of terms that you don't think can be coined and kind of turned into tokens seem to end up that way: sustainable, regenerative agriculture. And a lot of times you attend these and you hear all sorts of information and research that should be relevant to applicable farm use for farmers and ranchers in the field, and it seems like that transition is really hard to make. Lots of times there's panels at the end with a few farmers talking about a few things, and I always find that to me seems to be the most useful and the most interesting, and I glean the most information, and I always feel like I'm flocking at the end of those conferences to those people. So to have a room full of us together and listening to one another and sharing our experiences, both the good things and the bad things, because that is what I find how it is. My 9-year-old daughter constantly finds herself in these positions where she is just frustrated by, this didn't work right, and she gets so upset, almost to tears all the time. And I have to remind her that the way that you find the right way to do something is by doing it wrong a lot of times. It takes tens of hundreds, sometimes thousands. You look at people that are doing something right, it's because they've been doing it a lot and getting it wrong a lot, and that's what leads you to right. So that's kind of what I'm gonna focus on a lot of wrongs that we've done and things where I am starting to see successes and things that are right. So our farm is on probably a little bit smaller scale than most people, but we feel like we really try to do a lot of very diverse things. I don't have a background in farming. I can't stand up here and tell you that I'm the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd. I am the 1st. I was interested in land management and finding ways to have a personal impact on taking a piece of land and finding ways of doing something better. I think that comes with pros and cons. It's nice sometimes to have the history of family to share experiences and to share successes over time, but I also come to the table without a lot of baggage. I don't have somebody telling me how it should be done. I go read something, I try it, and I figure it out. And both my husband and I come to the table that way. Although I do have farming in my background, and I think the bug came to me from in my youth. Both my parents grew up on small farms through the Depression era, and they both decided to get away from it. But I was lucky enough to have a family farm that I got to visit every summer in Saskatchewan. Giant open fields of flax, canola, wheat, with cows, and I think the bug got instilled in me there. So I think I'll just start a little bit by saying some of the reasons why I got into cover cropping. I kind of didn't just think it up and think like, oh, that'd be a great idea, that'd be fun to try something different. Can anybody tell me what they see in this picture? If you're on the Palouse, you should know what it is. Nada. Yeah, so I started having some resource concerns about having annual weed invasions in my fields. And why are these things happening? It's because I have poor soils. And they've been farmed in a way that isn't feeding the soil bacteria. And so when you're looking at cover cropping, there's so many reasons for why we want to do cover crops, and there's so many benefits that can come from that. And this is just a short list of what I controlled, or what I came up with. But my first reason going into it was just trying to manage a weed that was taking over and making it so I didn't have food for my animals. So when we started with our ground, it had been originally, it was all timber ground, so it started off already not really having healthy soils for growing crops in the beginning. And then on top of that, after it was clear cut, it was farmed for 30 plus years with a lot of chemicals and a lot of tillage, so a lot of compaction happening in our soils. We instantly, when we purchased it, converted everything over, instead of annual crops, over to perennial crops and pastures. And pretty quickly, because of our soils being so poor, found that the weed infestations of noxious weeds and annual weeds was pretty hard to try and help maintain those. And that's when we started looking at cover crops as a way to see if we might be able to improve our soil quality so that we could have more food for our livestock. So this is just showing a couple of different stages of, we now also use a no-till drill. And again, I said on a small scale, so we, well, most of you have probably really large equipment. We have small equipment. Every field that I plant is with a 10 or 12 foot drill, no-till drill, but it allows me a lot of ability to really, after I go in and graze something, I can take like a 10, 12 acre paddock and I can drill right back into something after it. So I can get multiple layers of cropping happening within the same season. So these are kind of our basic principles that we try to live by on our farm. Not sure if anyone's familiar with Gabe Brown's book, Dirt to Soil. I see a lot of heads nodding, which is really awesome. And his 5 principles are the things that I really believe are the answer to finding solutions to having active soils again. Instead of looking at the plants and trying to think of how to make the plants grow better, let's look at the soil and how to have better soil, and then the plants naturally will grow better within that. That's a picture of our small no-till drill. So I've been doing cover cropping for going on 7 years this year. We started off, and a lot of times I do hear people talk about cover cropping, farmers saying, oh, I tried that, it didn't work. I found that when I first started looking at data about cover cropping and found that a lot of the research had been done in areas that I didn't feel were very applicable, I instantly would dismiss things that were in irrigated farm ground. That doesn't apply to me. I would dismiss things that were in, even Palouse soils. I talked to, neighbors and friends of mine that are in Genesee, and crops that they try and plant there are not going to be the same as what I'm trying to plant here. I have a whole different soil and climatic conditions that are happening on my property. So, and I guess what I was going to say about that time frame of growing cover crops for that period of time, the first probably 3 or 4 years of doing that, in trying to learn about what are the best things to plant in my regional area, what are the most successful things, how do I get the benefit and actually yield something off of that, because it can't be such an experiment that I can't actually get some growth off of my herd of cows off of that. I only have a limited supply of land and I need to have a certain amount of production off of that. And so the first handful of years, I was using such a small diversity of seeds and really only looking to what was being produced in our regional area. And I found that that was really limiting, and the success because of that was really limiting. When I started broadening my perspective of what cover crops could and should be, thinking about how important the number of diversity of species within that mix is, just like Mike was talking about, that really starts to change the dynamics of what's happening in the soil. If you look at a traditional, like say Palouse Prairie system that used to be here before farming came into our regional area, and you look at the species diversity that happens in there, there's like 300 different types of species growing in one small area. And how does that work? How do we have been kind of programmed to think that diversity is competition, instead of thinking of diversity as all of these species working together to find what their niche is. Some are going down deep, some are flowering or blossoming at different times of the year, some of them might die off, and they all in harmony work within the same place. And so having that diversity helps activate all the various microorganisms that are happening with the soil. So this is I was just going to talk about what we did last year, because it's kind of the most diverse one that we've done to date. And this is what we planted for our spring mix last year. It was a 15-way mix, and we tried to select species from all of the different areas, including legumes, grasses, broadleaves, and brassicas. And yeah, you look at that seed bin when you're putting it in the bin, and it just makes you feel good looking at all the diversity in the seeds. And I agree with information that other people have shared today about, we had a lot of concerns. Our drill has multiple boxes for different types of seeds to be able to plant and make sure that they all get in, so that they're not all maybe small seeds. Like you think of clovers and how tiny they are, and you think, oh, those are just gonna all go to the bottom, and you're gonna have one giant patch of clover. It doesn't work that way. Like it really is very good at dispersing and being universally distributed when it actually grows in a field. One thing that we learned with the very diverse mix that was interesting, and something we kind of had to adjust to in thinking about how we're integrating our livestock in that, is that there are different times, like, so this is an example of one time of the season when the yellow mustard was growing and blooming. But there's all sorts of other things happening underneath, and we'd have these waves of color. I'd have my neighbors go, what is that light yellow thing you have growing out there? And then like 2 weeks later, what is that blue thing growing out there? Like things that they aren't familiar with seeing, because it would just take over the entire field. But other things were happening underneath and around that weren't flowering. So that was a really cool thing. Learning how to graze that in a way that you're constantly being able to move them, because when we have all of our fields planted in it, we're moving them through at different times. So I'll touch on that a little bit too. So the type of grazing that we do is typically, there's a lot of different names for it. We call it planned grazing, mob grazing, intensive grazing. We use electric wires within our existing high tensile fence, and depending on what time of the year that we're grazing them, like early in the season when it's going gangbusters, sometimes I'm out there moving them 3 or 4 times a day. And people say, oh, I don't have time for that. And I'm just like, it took me 5 minutes. It's an electric wire with a bunch of pig wheels, or pigtail posts that you step in with your foot in the time of the year when the ground's really soft, and you can put it up in 5 minutes. My kids do it. I send my 11-year-old out, and he'll do it for me if I prod him hard enough. But it's not complicated, but it's actually kind of a cool way to spend your day, to integrate 5 minutes of walking through a field of flowering plants and having your cows waiting at the fence for you, happily walking across. It's made our cows really gentle, easy to manage, and they look forward to the moves, especially that time of day, or that many times a day. It's not like that the whole year. As we get later into the season, especially, as it's getting more into fall, we were a little concerned because we couldn't graze through it fast enough. They were getting so much feed, and it was taking them so much, even when we were making sure that we were leaving enough to have armor on the soil so that they weren't eating it all down and letting some things go to seed, that we had a couple fields that looked like they got pretty rank. And we're just like, oh, we finally got a little bit of rain in the fall, and some of the grass that was some of the remaining perennial grasses that hadn't completely come out of that field were starting to green back up, and we're like, oh, okay, well, maybe that 8 acres we can throw them on and they'll at least eat that grass. And it was really interesting to watch that, because what we didn't think there was left in forage value from the cover crop, they didn't touch the grass for 3 weeks in this 8-acre field. Why? Because those cover crops had matured and they had provided all of this forage. We're just waiting for them to break out of our fencing. And we come back out and they're just all laying out there chewing their cud happily, full, day after day after day, when what we're looking out there seeing seems like it's pretty dry and doesn't have a lot of interest from our perspective, but to them, they were happily on it for longer than we ever thought they would be. So I was gonna just touch a little bit on, I'll step back a minute from this image, but I was gonna mention, I just recently went to a workshop, and there was a project mentioned there that was called the American Gut Project. I don't know if anybody's heard about it. It was a study that was done from 2012 and culminated to a bunch of data last year in 2018. About 11,000 people were involved in this study. And this seems like it might be a little off topic, but I'll bring it back. I found it really interesting because these people all across the world paid $100 to participate in this study where they looked at the people would track for a certain period of time their daily consumption, like what food they ate, what kind of, at every meal for like a month. And they'd send this data in along with fecal samples, and they would study the biological activity that's going on with within the human gut. What they found was that the people that were the healthiest, that had the least amount of disease, the least amount of health issues and problems, and were the healthiest overall, were people that consumed 30 plus different kinds of plants and fruits in their diet on a regular basis, like per week. And I guess the way that I see that and how it relates to what we're talking about with soils and ecosystems and how the biology happening within our soil, to me, is really similar to thinking about the human gut. We've heard several people here today relate back how the food that we grow and the food we produce overall is becoming less and less nutritious. And so if we're looking at what's happening in our soil biology and thinking about how that ultimately culminates in a head of wheat or in a steak, those things start to matter. And that same amount of diversity that they're seeing is a result of happening and being healthy inside of the human gut is similar in soils. I recently attended a presentation, if any of you have ever heard of Dr. Christine Jones. She's a soil scientist out of Australia. And amazingly, she just came to Ferdinand, Idaho. I don't know if anybody else attended that. It was really cool to see her there. I just felt so, it was just so cool to hear her talking about all of these things and how, some of her research indicates that there is a minimum number of plants necessary in planting cover crops to really start to see how all of those plants work together to create this active biological activities within our soils. So this is Phacelia. We planted it not because it was really a particularly good forage for our animals, but because it's an attractor of native pollinators, and it is just it was a good plant to diversify. The animals didn't actually eat it, which we were okay with. It kind of ended up just being some of our armor on the soil after they went through a field. But it's kind of cool to see all your cows out there and a bunch of purple flowers. This is the cover crop that we just put in the fall. We felt really fortunate to get a nice bit of moisture right before we were able to plant this and had it come up really, really nice. But you'll notice there that my diversity of species is a little low. So even though I kind of feel like I am learning things every single time, the winter is my stop and find out what should we do different this year. But we're pretty happy with what we're seeing so far. One of the other things I'll mention too is that our soils are pretty acidic. They started off at a lower pH just because it's timber ground, but then was farmed for a long period of time. There's proven data that shows that application of anhydrous ammonium lowers the soil pH, and we're seeing pretty significant accumulation of that in our soils now, like down to 5 and below in some areas, which can be very detrimental. I mean, it gets to the point where you have aluminum toxicity happening and the nutrients are just not available. But what was really cool about talking to Dr. Jones about that was that she felt really confident that the direction of using cover crops and the diversity of species and using bioinoculants is the answer, even when your soils are super degraded and have really low fertility. And we're seeing it. We're growing things that we haven't ever been able to grow before too. So I really wish that I had somebody like Mike tracking my crops and fields, because I feel like I have a really hard time getting very good images of the stuff that I do throughout the season because I'm too busy in the day of just dealing with what has to be done. But this is a few examples of what we do. You can see on the right there, on the foreground, right here, is where we had just moved. It was a little bit moist to put them in there, but we kind of use the grazing as a way, if we're gonna plant something into it and we don't wanna kill off the perennials, as doing an intercropping. We'll have the animals go in and graze it beforehand, and then we can seed something into it. But this is like, we'll have them on there for, a day, and then we'll move them up here. And it's like within a week, you can see the grass is already starting to regrow when you do this kind of grazing. Instead of putting them on a large acreage, I just calculate, do I have 50 cows and this is what they need for a day? And maybe I didn't get it quite right, so I have to go out one more time and move them again because they're gonna eat it down too low. I really gauge it based on what I'm seeing happening, and that is constantly changing. And then pigs on cover crops is awesome too. So it's not their main forage, we still give them grains, locally Palouse grown grains, but they love the forage, and I think it makes a very remarkable difference in the kind of pork that we produce, and they love it. And they're super cute when they get a new patch of a cover crop to go out. We have a bunch of areas where we kind of have our sacrifice areas for cows over the winter, and we go in there after the cows go out on grass to calve in the spring. We go through and plant all of our winter pens with a variety of different cover crops, and then we strip graze all of our pork or pigs through there. And then I guess just thinking about that whole ecosystem thing, I wanted to highlight a few other things. We do a lot of plant restoration. So in that same light of thinking that I didn't really ever think I'd be up here talking as a farmer, I actually have a background in education and landscape architecture with a real emphasis on native plant restoration. So having my own piece of property where I get to do all that work is just really amazing, and I feel lucky to be able to do it. All of our drainages on our property where water flows at any time of the year are all fenced off and planted back into native forages, a lot of Palouse prairie native forbs as part of that. And as a piece of that, we try and encourage a lot of native pollinators, and we are working with an organization that has comes and monitors kestrel boxes, but that's my daughter monitoring that one. It's pretty cool to let them be part of the process of, it takes all of these different things to make an ecosystem function properly, and having natural predators that help with various populations of insects that might be on there is all a piece of it. Oops. That was the one I wanted to show. So they got to, when the guys came out to band the kestrels that were born on our property, which it's pretty cool. They had on the Palouse, I want to say they had 42 nest boxes at various places. They had 5 on our property. 3 of our boxes, the first year that they were up, had kestrel nests in them. And so they would come and capture the kestrels and band them. And so they let our kids release the kestrels when they're done, which they thought was pretty cool. And then this is just highlighting that the value of having native plants and native pollinators in strip areas within all of our fields, we feel is like an added step to help us diversify. We're providing habitat for the insects. The beneficial insects are, to me, a big part of also fulfilling that, biological system. And then we also add more, because if you have a lot of flowering cover crops and you have a lot of pollinators in your place, the success of them is greater. This is my son putting the new bees inside of their box.
Newbies.
So, anyone has any questions?
We probably have time for maybe one question.
What fencing are you using for your pigs?
We do have a high tensile in some of it, but we use a single electric wire. Pigs are pretty easy to train on electric wire. They respect it. I was just talking to somebody today about that. Like, you can take a wire down from a spot where you've had it, and they won't want to go there because they know it's been there. They've defined it as part of their boundary. So, yeah, electric wire.
So we're going to head into a break, so we can ask Jen some more questions on the break if you'd like. So let's give her a round of applause.